We begin in South Africa, where President Jacob Zuma officially launched the country's 16 days of activism for no violence against women campaign in Johannesburg on Monday. He marked the occasion by visiting the AfricaLive Center for Abused Women in Johannesburg. This report from CCTV's Renee Delcam.
AfricaLive is the Zulu term for home of hope. And that's exactly what this place means to the women and children who find themselves seeking safety, security and shelter here. President Jacob Zuma met privately with some of the nearly 200 women living here at the moment. He said he'd been touched by their stories and praised the centre for referring to the abused women as clients instead of victims.
Some of them were almost at the point of ending their lives. But this place has changed them to be something. It's a touching story of AfricaLive.
AfricaLive is a one-stop centre which offers victim support services from healthcare to childcare, counselling and specialised police investigation to prosecutorial services, all under one roof. The centre even has a court preparation room where women are taught how to deal with confronting their alleged abusers in court.
At first, when you come here, you're so scared. But when you get empowered, the shelter has empowered me in such a way that as broken as I am, I might look strong, but inside, after especially rape, you're so broken. You're not the same again.
Norma Mbele has been here for the past 6 months and says she's determined to talk about her ordeal, if it will encourage and empower other women.
We don't deserve to be violated. And I want to send a message to all men out there. When you violate me, when you rape me, you actually break my soul. My soul is so broken, it's never gonna be healed. I'm not angry towards men. But what happened to me changed me forever.
Around 8,000 women like Norma Mbele have passed through the doors of AfricaLive since it opened in 2004. President Zuma says he's so impressed with this unique place of safety, he wants to see it replicated across the country. Renee Delcam, CCTV, Johannesburg.
Well, let's get more on this now. An analysis by Saida Ali, the Executive Director of the Coalition on Violence Against Women, joining me here in Nairobi. Welcome to AfricaLive. Now, what's the expectation, though, on that 16 days of activism?
Basically, there's a focus on 3 sub-themes. One around state accountability in addressing violence against women. The second one, the need to address conflict-related violence against women, especially cases of mass rapes and using sexual crimes as war crimes. And then the third one is a focus on domestic violence with emphasis on the need to address the issue of small arms presence at the family level, because then it exposes women to more danger in terms of risks of domestic violence.
Well, a lot has been documented on gender-based violence, though, in South Africa, in Kenya, in Eastern DRC. How widespread, though, is it across the continent?
The situation is quite dire. When you look at Kenya, for instance, 1 in 3 women have admitted to have gone through either physical or sexual violence. According to research that was done by WHO, the highest rates of intimate partner violence, 71% prevalence, was found in a rural part of Ethiopia, which is in Africa. The least prevalence was in Japan. Which means perhaps there are efforts in other parts of the world to actually address it and to have state accountability that also ties to the need to address impunity, both at a state level and at citizens level. Then you have places such as South Africa where every 30 minutes a woman is raped. Then you look at situations of conflict such as DRC, Darfur, and on a daily basis, when you combine the cases in Darfur and DRC, it's about 1,000 women raped on a daily basis.
When you look at the contributory factors, though, leaving aside the war zone, the conflict areas like Eastern DRC and Darfur, as you mentioned, the contributory factors across the continent, what would those be?
I think generally, and part of what we are focusing on during 16 days is the issue of militarism. And this has nothing to do with the conflict itself. It's a mindset that actually elevates a certain form of being, you know, addressing situations by using violence. So a rise in militarization, the issue of culture, which is across board, and how cultural practices are used to justify violence against women, and the need to, or the silencing of women that speak out or want to speak out about it. But one more thing also is around the criminal justice system. And this is a problem across board. When women report and nothing happens, then it becomes a situation that makes women not report. And some women will stay in violence or in abusive relationships because of dependency as a result of not being economically independent. So there are many factors, but we emphasize that there is need to have state accountability as well.
All right, just stay with us there, Saida, for the moment. As CCTV's Jane Keo is also joining us there from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Jane, we have been talking about what's been documented from the Eastern DRC, particularly in relation to gender-based violence, though. The DRC has been embroiled in war, in conflict. How has that violence, though, affected the women there?
Well, Beatrice, as you can imagine, it certainly had a huge and critical effect, given that this is an area that has known no peace. In fact, that's why some people will often say that this is one of the worst places to be a woman. And the figures speak for themselves. The statistics speak for themselves. More than 7,000 cases of violence against women, particularly rape, were reported last year alone. According to the UN, those figures have certainly risen this year because of the recurring violence. Now, according to the victims, most of those who commit these crimes are armed men from whatever rebel group or Congolese soldiers. Remember, FRDC, the government soldiers, have been on the spot because of this. Only last week we had 39 soldiers, Congolese soldiers, go on trial because of rape charges against 130 women in Minova here in Eastern DRC. And Beatrice, I have to say, it's also imagine that rape is no longer just a weapon of war here in DRC. It's somewhat a society, a community problem where women are just seen as objects, and that's why it comes as no surprise that the DRC has been chosen as one of the 5 countries in this 16-day campaign. Beatrice?
Jane, would you say, though, that authorities have been doing enough to end the violence and bring culprits to book there in the DRC?
Well, Beatrice, many are of the opinion that authorities haven't actually done much to curb the vice. And in fact, as we speak, many of the cases still go unreported. And this has to do with a problem within the system, right from the bottom all the way through to the judiciary. And largely because the major impediment in all this is corruption within the system, many will still be protecting one of their own. But that case of the 39 soldiers last week, the trial of the 39 soldiers last week, has raised hopes that maybe the government is finally putting its act together, is finally trying to gain the confidence of the people in dealing with this vice that has been a problem here in Eastern DRC for the longest time, following that defeat or the routing out of the M23 rebels by the government soldiers. Beatrice?
And you mentioned there, though, that gender-based violence has become a part of society life there in the DRC. What's the public reaction, though? What is at their doorstep? What can they do?
Well, Beatrice, like I said, some of them will report these cases, others will hold them back because of what has happened in the past. Once they go and report the cases, whether to the authorities, whether to the police, whether they take someone to court, nothing will be done about it. In fact, say for that case of the 39 soldiers that was done here in Goma last week, that is the only sign that they've seen of the government actually trying to deal with this case in the last in recent times. So that has raised hopes that the government is actually trying to do something in regards to rape here in Eastern DRC. And right now, many people are enjoying a season of peace, hoping that this is a problem that will be curbed once and for all. Beatrice?
All right. Saida, just coming to you on that point that Jane has made there. The government is trying to do a lot there in Eastern DRC. Across the continent, though, is there a feeling generally that national policies are taking this into consideration?
I think there is not just a feeling, but the fact that governments are making an effort, and it's not just individual governments, but also at the African Union level. We have the Maputo Protocol that actually specifically talks about protection and the need for state members in Africa to take measures to protect women from violence against women at different times, whether conflict or non-conflict times.
All right, Saida Ali, Executive Director at the Coalition on Violence Against Women, joining us here in studio. Thank you. And CCTV's Jane Keo joining us from Eastern DRC on that situation there. Thank you for your updates. Now, let's go to Libya, where troops have been fighting a powerful Islamist militia in the eastern city of Benghazi. At least 9 people have been killed and nearly 50 wounded, civilians among them. The army has declared a state of alert. CCTV's Kofam Renje has more.
Some of the first casualties from the clashes, and there were many more as the fighting in Benghazi spread. Soldiers say the Islamist militia Ansar al-Sharia shot first.
A group from Ansar al-Sharia fired on a patrol belonging to the Thunderbolt Brigade at one of the intersections. We, the 1st Division, then arrived from another location and we found them hiding in a residential home wearing military uniforms. The neighbors then left and there were people who were killed and others wounded, including a young girl.
The fighting closed down schools. People were urged to stay home, but an appeal went out for blood donors too. Militia played a key role in toppling Muammar Gaddafi, but they've defied government attempts to control them since then, and bloody clashes are common. Just last week, hundreds of people demonstrated in Tripoli against the militia. Several groups have been expelled from the capital. Libyan Prime Minister Ali Zidane was in London this past weekend, seeking support in his attempts to establish his government's authority.
The United States and the United Kingdom have confirmed to us their continued support for Libya to become a democratic and independent state with positive input in terms of the international political effort and economic effort to build a peaceful society.
But this latest fighting is more evidence of the task facing Zidane and Libya. The uprising against Gaddafi began in Benghazi almost 3 years ago. The city remains one of Libya's most volatile areas. Kofam Renje, CCTV.
You're watching Africa Live. Coming up. Counting losses. DR Congo Army releases casualty figures after defeating the M23 rebels. And a deal is reached on reducing greenhouse emissions. We ask, what is in it for Africa? You're watching Africa Live. I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. The Congolese military has released the first official casualty figures from its recent defeat of the M23 rebels. From Goma, CCTV's Jen Keo has more.
Well, the figures come from one side and one officer, General Jean-Lucien Bahuma, a senior commander in North Kivu region. But they give the first indication of the human cost of recent fighting here. Now, according to General Bahuma, 721 M23 rebels were killed and more than 540 captured, scores of Rwandans and Ugandans among them. The army lost 201 men, with another 680 wounded. 3 peacekeepers also died. Now, that's not the toll for the entire rebellion, which started early last year. It's just the tally for the past 6 months up to November, when the military declared the M23 rebellion crashed. Well, so far, there's no official figure for the civilian casualties. Maybe that number will never be known. From Goma in eastern DRC, I'm Jane Keo for CCTV.
Meanwhile, Uganda says lasting peace can only be achieved in the Democratic Republic of Congo if the country's government makes a concerted effort to reach agreement with the M23 rebels. The Ugandan Foreign Ministry says Kampala is only playing a mediation role and that the DRC must deal with its own problems. Uganda will also only make a decision on what to do with the M23 commander Sultan Makenga and over 1,500 rebel fighters after a deal is signed. Makenga is at the moment in the custody of the Ugandan army at an undisclosed location. The DR Congo government wants the final deal to be called a declaration and not an agreement because it claims it can't sign a peace agreement with a defeated force.
If they want peace in their country, it is up to them to be the first people to make that initiative and make serious initiative to really bring peace in their countries. The rest are just supporting.
Now, governments around the world have just over a year in which to set out their targets on curbing greenhouse gas emissions from 2020 after marathon overnight climate change talks in Warsaw produced a partial deal. Under the agreement settled in the early hours of Sunday morning after more than 36 hours of non-stop negotiations, countries have until the first quarter of 2015 to publish their plans. And this process is seen as essential to achieving a new global deal on emissions at a Crunch conference in Paris in late 2015, for which the fortnight-long Warsaw conference was supposed to lay the groundwork. The emissions goal is to come into force from 2020 and will be set at a national level, but after they are published, there will be a chance for other countries to scrutinize them and assess whether they are fair and sufficiently ambitious. Let's now get more details on the just concluded climate change conference. We're joined in studio live by Dr. Richard Munang, the African Regional Climate Change Coordinator at the United Nations Environmental Programme. Welcome to Africa Live. Let's first get your thoughts on the just concluded talks and what is in it exactly for Africa.
Thank you very much for having me in studio. I think that Africa have got a lot with the discussions and with the just concluded Conference of Parties, the COP19. Africa went into this conference urging that the world should be able to replenish the global climate fund called the Green Fund to ensure that the amount of money which was pledged should be replenished to ensure this fund can provide the money which is needed to address climate change in developing countries, especially Africa. And one of the issues was also to look at how the world could come up with a mechanism to address onset events like drought, like floods, as a result of the changing climate. And another was also to look at how the world could agree to reduce emissions by 2 degrees, which, as the International Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change has indicated, if the world reached 2 degrees, the impacts will be catastrophic for the African continent. So these were the issues on the table, and the just concluded COP19 move a step forward towards discussing and putting in place a framework to discuss the legal agreement that will be fostered in 2015 in Paris. So there is progress made, albeit small steps, but the world is moving towards that agreement.
Agreements have been made, progress has been made, as you mentioned there, though. But what exactly has been achieved since the last meeting? Or, when you talk about funds having been set aside for Africa there, what exactly has been achieved since the last meeting? Or is it just pledges and empty talk?
I think there has been progress made. If you look in Cancun, where there was COP16 after Copenhagen, the Green Climate Fund was set up. And also there was a decision that the national adaptation plans for countries, whereby countries can be able to integrate climate change into decision-making frameworks and development processes. That process is currently ongoing and countries are already engaged in that. There's also the Adaptation Fund, which is a fund that was put in place to help fund adaptation in developing countries. In Warsaw, there was a decision where there were also pledges up to about 100 million put in place to ensure that adaptation can be addressed. Not everything is addressed equally, but at the same time there is progress that is being made, and as indicated, albeit small steps, there is potentially going to be a kind of a culmination towards an agreement in Lima in 2014, Peru, where the world will come together again, COP20, discuss the elements that were discussed in Warsaw, so that as they move towards Paris in 2015, all the elements that have been discussed and will be discussed in Lima could be put together in a way that the world can actually come to a legal binding agreement and help limit emissions.
How will that adaptation plan, though, assist Africa in getting out of harm's way in the short term?
Well, right up to the COP19 in Warsaw, the United Nations Environment Programme produced a report called the Africa Adaptation Gap Report. And what this entailed was actually to show exactly the impacts that are currently existing in the continent as a result of the changing climate and also the projected impacts. And this report clearly shows that the changing climate change is already having impacts in the continent and is projected to have huge impacts. For example, sea level rise in the African continent is going to be 10% higher than the global mean, disrupting a lot of coastal cities, and in a continent where you have about 26,000 kilometers of coastline, with almost about 32 countries with their coast, with most of the cities on the coastal line. This is quite going to be a very, very serious issue. For example, Dar es Salaam is going to suffer assets, lost assets up to about 10 billion, and even Mombasa in Kenya is going to suffer asset loss up to about 15 billion in 2050. So putting together adaptation actions which could be able to reduce this vulnerability to climate change is imperative, and the United Nations Environment Programme is pursuing a program in collaboration with other partners called ecosystem-based adaptation, using our ecosystems, our forests, our rivers, our seas, and the services they provide to ensure that they can be able to address the changing climate. There is an example like in Mozambique whereby restoration of mangroves help address some of the climate challenges, and even in Togo, using small dam rehabilitation through ecological-based approaches help provide water to the communities in this country. All
right, Dr. Richard Munang, Africa Regional Climate Change Coordinator, UNEP. We're going to leave it there for the moment, but thank you for joining us here on Africa Live. Now, let's get other stories we are following for you at this moment. The United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, says that the number of children caught up with armed groups has increased when at least 6,000 in the Central African Republic, a landlocked nation of over 4 million people, descended into violence and chaos after the Seleka rebels ousted President Francois Bozize in March. An estimated 400,000 people have been displaced and more than 60,000 others have fled to neighboring countries since the Seleka leader and interim President Michel Djotodia lost control of his coalition of warlords. Briefing journalists in Geneva, the UNICEF CAR representative Suleiman Diabete said the violence will increase unless the international community takes action. Poverty, displacement and an increase in armed groups means children are more vulnerable to recruitment.
If we don't do something, if the international community doesn't stand up and do something, I think we will probably, see a lot of killing going on there.
Staying in the region and to Mali, where low turnout and alleged vote abuses marred Sunday's parliamentary election. The poll was meant to complete the country's transition to democracy after a successful presidential election. Now, while a French-led military intervention in January drove militants controlling the northern territories, Mali has seen a resurgence in violence. Clementine Logan has more.
A surge in violence since August's presidential vote prompted Malian soldiers, French troops and UN peacekeepers to protect voting stations in the north. But officials say armed men carried off ballot boxes from some bureaus in the Timbuktu region. And in Talatay, Tuareg separatists reportedly destroyed ballot boxes. That's according to a military source. Only a fraction of the 6.7 million Malians registered to vote appeared to have cast their ballot on Sunday. There was no sign of the long queues that marked the presidential poll.
There was nothing abnormal in my polling station today. Everything went smoothly. But compared to the presidential elections turnout, we didn't even make it to 100 out of 481 registered voters by the end of the day.
Unlike the presidential elections, perhaps people do not know what's at stake. People think that once the president has been elected, he is the leader, I think the two elections do not have the same amount at stake.
The election of a new parliament is supposed to complete Mali's democratic transition in the wake of last year's coup. Ibrahim Boubacar Keita's RPM party is expected to win comfortably. Keita swept the August 11th presidential runoff with 78% of the vote and remains optimistic about this one.
I hope that these elections will take place peacefully and transparently, and that at the end of the day, we will have a national assembly of men and women who will achieve the project that the people of Mali have invested in. This is what I hope most of all, and that our country will find its friendliness and its harmony.
January's French-led military operation drove Islamist rebels from northern towns, but isolated cells have remained active. Some 1,087 candidates competed for the 147 seats in Parliament. A second round will be held on December 15th in constituencies where there is no majority winner. Keita's presidential rival, Soumaïla Cissé, aims to secure the post of parliamentary speaker and has pledged to form a vocal opposition. Clementine Logan, CCTV.
And we still have more news, views and analysis for you here on Africa Live, including stemming protests. Egypt signs new laws to end counter recurrent protests. And ferrying commuters. We take a look at the public transport sector in Cameroon.
International news with the global perspective. World Insight is the only program with analysis from around the world, with lively discussions and feature reports. Tuning each week for World Insight, only on CCTV News.
Well, let's head now to Northern Africa and to Egypt, where rights groups there have criticized the country's new protest laws. They include imposing bans, hefty fines and even jail sentences for violators in a bid to stifle the near-constant protests rolling the country. CCTV's Adel Mahroui tells us more.
10 days after Egypt came out of its state of emergency, it's now subject to 25 new rules on public protest, even more restrictive than those used by longtime ruler Hosni Mubarak. The law bans public gathering of more than 10 people without prior notice, and authorities can refuse permission should they decide the protest is a threat to public order. It gives police the right to use force, including tear gas and clubs, and stipulates strict jail terms, including 7 years for violence, 10 years for obtaining a weapon. The government says the new law will help restore stability, but critics say it strips Egyptians of basic freedoms.
This law is aimed at intimidating people and denying them a right to stage a revolution. It is not to frustrate the Muslim Brotherhood. The purpose is to end protest in the entire nation. This means that the government can do whatever it wants and remain silent. This will never happen.
Interim President Adli Mansour approved the new bill over the weekend, but it applies to protests planned before then. Anyone taking part in an unauthorized gathering will be fined $300 and/or jailed.
We do have criminal laws, and the old law against protest still exists. If people are violent, they can be contained using those laws, but the government is not applying them. According to the temporary constitution, the president must get parliament's approval for these new laws. If not the parliament, then a referendum. Otherwise, he cannot impose such harsh penalties.
Between regulating and oppressing protests, there's a thin line. But the fact remains, with the new law, the government is seeking full control over rallies. And already calls are spreading among many Egyptians to break the law by protesting on Tuesday to reject it. Adel Mahroui, CCTV, Cairo.
Commuters in Cameroon trying to get across to the capital, Yaoundé, have a few choices. Minibus, taxis and motorcycles are banned and there are few buses. One industry, though, is thriving. CCTV's Maria Galang tells us more.
A curious combination of fallen apart and blinged out. Yaoundé's black and yellow taxis are the way to go. They're common in Western Central African cities, but here they dominate, and they're known as taxi buses. Haggling is part of the service.
Bonsoir, monsieur. Alors, Pétain Central, c'est combien?
500.
Ah non, c'est juste là-bas. 300. Bon.
Compared to taxis in other African countries, these are relatively affordable. The average price, 200 francs, the equivalent of 40 American cents. You can also say depot if you want the taxi to yourself. This will cost you more, probably around 1,000 francs, but negotiation is key.
Before,
there were minibuses, but the government got rid of them. So this is the only transport in the city, because motorcycles are not allowed in the city center.
Demand Zache has been in the business for 8 years. He started working as a taxi driver for someone else, eventually saving up enough money to buy one of his own. The work is challenging, as you have to drive around non-stop for hours, picking up and dropping passengers to make a profit.
As a driver, you have to give 10,000 francs to your boss every day. So to earn money for yourself, you have to work extra hard. Some days you earn more, some days you earn less, but it evens out.
Traffic jams, bad roads and accidents are occupational hazards. For commuters, it can be frustrating just trying to find the right lift. Muriel Omasomba takes the taxi bus to work and back home every day.
It takes at least 2 to 5 minutes to find a taxi. It's very convenient. The only problem is finding a taxi bus that is headed where you are going.
20 minutes later, she is still waiting. Eventually, she finds a ride. Getting a taxi bus in Yaoundé may be a complicated process, but for the city's 1.8 million people, it's the only way. Maria Galang, CCTV, Yaoundé, Cameroon.